Okay, welcome. I'm Michael David Fox. I am Director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, East European Studies here at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Maria Lipman here to Russia Brief. Russia Brief is moderated by our own Jill Doherty, who is an adjunct professor here at CERES. We are hosting this event at CERES, but our sponsor is the Carnegie Foundation of New York. Now, Jill Doherty is formerly with CNN as White House correspondent, State Department correspondent, and Moscow bureau chief. So I'm very much looking forward to today's event. Jill, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. I really appreciate that. And very glad that everyone can join us here today. I am actually in Tbilisi, Georgia. I would give you a tour, but I don't want to technically destroy our webinar. But out the window, you can see the dying light here at 7 o'clock in Tbilisi, Georgia. And it's actually a very interesting place to watch the Russian election. After all, there are FSB border guard personnel along with their military equipment, just about 40-minute drive from this hotel, about 40 kilometers. And it's one of that yesterday, or I guess it was yesterday, visited one of 20 bases that the FSB has in Tskhinvali, which is South Ossetia. And they also have another 12 bases in Abkhazia. So those are both, of course, regions that have been occupied by Russia since the 2008 Russo-Georgian War. But that is another subject. Actually, we're going to get into Georgia probably in our next Russia brief. But today, it is the Russian presidential election. And many observers in the West say that word, election, with quotes around it. And there is no question that the vote was a highly stage-managed affair with liberal use of what Russians call administrative resources. Turnout was almost 77.5%, and according to Russia's Central Election Commission, Putin officially won 87.3% of the vote, highest ever. So to help us dissect the results of the election, we have our guest today joining us from Berlin, one of the most astute experts on Russia, and she is Maria Lipman. Briefly, I'm sure a lot of the people in the audience know exactly who she is, but she is Senior Visiting Fellow at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at GW, George Washington University. She's also in charge of the Ponar's Eurasia podcast and co-editor of the Institute's newly launched website, Russia Post, and they both come very highly recommended. So we're going to discuss this for about a half an hour, and then we'll open to questions from the audience, and you can put those in the Q&A function below on your screen. And I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. So about a half an hour talk, and then we'll open it up. So please begin thinking about the questions you want to ask. Maria, again, thank you very much for being here. Welcome from Berlin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jill, and thank you, Georgetown University. It's an honor to be invited to this event, this webinar, and I'll be happy to answer your questions to the extent that it is only possible.
Well, if anyone can, you can. So let's begin, I think maybe with that high number. I mean, if you have almost 90% for Vladimir Putin, we're getting into the atmosphere, the stratosphere for the vote. And I think the question I would ask is, why did they need to get that? If, of course, using administrative resources, why did they feel that they had to go that high?
The election, of course, is a totally premeditated affair, and the results are preordained, but not such high results. It is true that the results have been the highest ever. And I should say that the election may be fully preordained to the Russian people. Everyone is positive that Putin would win. However, this is a very difficult time and intense work for every Russian administrator, high and low. The administrators are under very heavy pressure to deliver the desired result. The desires are expressed by the president's administration. And there is this sense that you are not a good administrator if you fail to deliver what is expected of you. A few months prior to the election, it was rumored, I wouldn't say reported, because these days nobody can refer to a single concrete source in the Kremlin, but it was rumored that the Kremlin set the requirement that both the turnout and the vote for Putin should be higher than it was 6 years ago in 2018 when he stood his previous election. And this meant over 80% turnout. We didn't know how much higher than 80, and I'm sorry, yeah, over 70% turnout and over 80% votes. Now, apparently, the officials tried very hard because they delivered, as you mentioned, this very high turnout of 77% and the vote for Putin at 87%. I would point out also that 6 years ago, the result was not only lower, but Putin had fewer contenders, or actually contenders. There were 7 back in 2018 and just 3 this time. Putin had 3. Well, I stopped short of calling them real competitors. However, there were 3 other people who were allowed to run. And the reason for the number being so much smaller now, I think indirectly points to the intention of the Kremlin prior to this election to get an even higher result for Putin, so that the non-Putin vote would be divided between unpopular figures among very weak competitors. So this too, the fact that just 3 were allowed to be on the ballot this time indicates that the Kremlin administration was getting prepared for delivering a really high result. One more thing I would add, if we go back to 2008, when Putin actually stepped down after 2 legitimate terms that the Constitution provided for, and the question was, why is he even stepping down? He was so popular in Russia that actually, I think most of Russians would have reconciled to the fact that if he had decided to run again, despite the constitutional terms. The thinking back then, the analysis back then, was that Putin did not want to look like some of the Central Asian leaders who actually extended their terms indefinitely. And that he wanted to look more Western, more European, to meet European standards. However, this time around, apparently, he is no longer concerned, if we need more evidence for that. He is no longer concerned about the approval of the West. And his results today are very similar, actually, to the results of omnipotent rulers, uncontested rulers of Central Asia.
Yes. I wanted to drill down a little bit into the people who voted for him, because you mentioned the pressure on the administrators who had to turn out the vote. But you also have, at this point, also because of the war, the economy is getting more into, is bringing more people in as budjetniki, the people who are on the budget. They get the social payments. They work in factories, government-owned factories or whatever, or maybe they get pensions, et cetera. Could you kind of give us an idea, did that fact that there are more people now on the government payroll play a role, do you think, in this vote?
Yes, very much so. Putin, of course, is very popular, and he comes across the Russian people as uncontested and unchallenged. His very long term in power actually is conducive to that. The war itself is conducive to that. Putin is seen, according to focus groups, as the irreplaceable defender of the nation, because in the minds of many Russians, this Russia's war in Ukraine is actually seen as Russia defending itself against the West. But much as Putin is popular and supported, in a preordained election, there's always the problem of the turnout. Why even bother and come and vote if you know the result ahead of time. And actually, the result is something that if this is not what you dream about, you're certainly reconciled to it. So this means that the administrators, as I said, are thinking of various ways, and especially the Kremlin administration, the very savvy Kremlin aides, are constantly thinking about how to deliver a higher turnout. Several new tricks that have appeared since the previous election 6 years ago and in between, back then in 2018 and now. One is the 3-day vote. And the 3-day vote means that at least one of the 3 days was a Friday. So Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Friday is a working day. People who are at work are actually seen and watched by their boss. And with a majority of Russians, as you mentioned, are being actually civil servants, or they get salaries that are budget drawn. So they are under pressure from their immediate boss, who actually, tells them, go and vote and come back. It's not like it happened on a Sunday and you may lie, but you are there under the eyes of your boss. This is a factor. Also, the mere fact that it was 3 days enables or helps the administrators to increase the turnout. So you didn't vote today, vote tomorrow, vote the day after. Electronic vote, which was introduced recently, which we had not had in previous elections, is a way to actually play with the results, to put it, in a figurative way, or simply to falsify and rig. And according to observers, I don't mean election observers, we didn't have those, or those that we had were not independent. According to election analysts, the rigging was actually quite substantial. The fact that the people with budget-drawn salaries are actually many more now, they have become many more, and especially since the beginning of the war, because there are more government positions, there is a shortage of workforce in Russia for a variety of reasons, for the military-industrial complex, the war itself, of course, the fighters and their families, and more state property on industrial enterprises. So all of that comes down to, we have an even larger percentage of people who depend on the budget and therefore depend on the state, which makes them more pliable, more amenable to pressure from their boss or to pressure from other government officials.
Yeah. I'm sure a lot of people were watching some of the reporting on the election, and you obviously must have seen the video of people standing in long lines, both in Russia and around the world, in Washington, D.C. and other places, and in Berlin. Navalny's wife, I guess, was in line for 6 hours to vote. Now, why were they all there? We know, because the different opposition groups came up with the idea of noon without Putin, or midday, Poldzin bez Putina. And so it got a very, very big turnout. And I thought what was interesting about that, Maria, was that it was not an illegal act. I mean, what they were doing is they were going to vote. Of course, they were not going to vote, I'm sure, for Putin, but they were not creating, they weren't, breaking down windows or doing anything. It was completely legal. So it made it very hard for the authorities to arrest people. Now, there were some people, I still don't quite understand who they were, but the people who threw green ink on some ballots, that's kind of an exception, I think. But I'm talking about these big numbers for noon without Putin. So I was interested in what you thought about that strategy, and were you surprised by the numbers of people who had turned out? And then I guess the ultimate question is, did it make any difference? I mean, it didn't change the vote, but did it make any type of difference?
Of course, I was surprised, and I don't think we ever had this before, that abroad in a variety of countries, people were waiting in lines. Indeed, here in Berlin, the line was very long, and I've already heard from people who waited for 6 and more hours in the line. I was not here on the election days, but this is what I heard, and of course, watched. There were videos from all over. Well, voting is legal, and in theory, it is secret, right? It is a secret ballot. So until the person reaches the ballot box and drops his ballot, you don't know who they are going to vote for. So there is no reason to detain or arrest them. However, those who showed up at noontime on Sunday, I think the majority of them in voting stations abroad were there because of the late, unfortunately, Alexei Navalny's call. Not initiated by him, by the way, it was somebody else, an opposition activist, but Navalny, who at that point was still in his penal colony, somehow encouraged people to join this way of expressing their discontent and their disagreement. Now, on whether it made a difference in the election, of course not. As we see, the election result reported by the authorities is this overwhelming, very high turnout and overwhelming vote for Putin. On the political meaning of it, well, I'm afraid I will sound disappointing to those who believe that this can make a difference politically. You know, what happened with all those huge crowds who came to voting precincts abroad, I think it was yet another event in which they could look at each other and realize that there are many, and smile at each other, and to be thinking that everyone around me, or almost, is like-minded, and see how many we are. I think last time they experienced this kind of feeling was very recent. It was when Alexei Navalny died, and on the day of his funeral. And before that, at numerous, especially here in Berlin, anti-war rallies where lots of these new emigres, new exiles from Russia got together. So yes, there were also those who you mentioned, but individual cases who tried to express their discontent by something other than simply damaging the ballot, or it was common as an intention. Of course, I haven't seen those ballots, to write Navalny across the ballot instead of marking your preferred candidate. Or write something nasty addressed to the authorities. So individual cases like that, or individual cases of indeed pouring some kind of green liquid into the ballot box, those were very few individual cases. But you know, there's no shortage of brave people in Russia, given how oppressive, how repressive the government has become. All the time, there are small episodes of people who are actually sacrificing themselves, knowing full well they would be punished, and punished severely. People who write graffiti against the war, or even against Putin, or people who write something on their social networks, again, knowing full well they will not go unpunished. They will not get away with it. So Russia has brave people. And Russia certainly has constituencies who are against the war, who are disturbed, and who feel the war is something that is really disturbing and alarming to them. What Russia does not have is any kind of a political structure for the opposition-minded people to make a difference. No independent parliament, and we haven't that for many, many years now. No independent judiciary, no opportunity to come together for political or even civic organization. Almost no non-governmental media around. And without this political structure, No matter how brave people are, they do not make a difference politically. And the only person who could claim to be the leader, or I'd rather say the most popular among the opposition, the prominent opposition figures, Alexei Navalny, is now dead. Yeah, well, we may admire the courage of those people and their self-sacrifice. Of those who went to jail, but it does not make a difference politically.
Yeah. Could I pick up on the Navalny movement? We do have Yulia Navalny. She's speaking out. She's been very active, since his death. She is not Alexei. She's a much more quiet person. He was just, as everyone knows, an extraordinary communicator and had such an ability to really inspire people. And she's kind of a different type of person. I was talking to some Russians who said, well, she might grow into a role, kind of like Tikhanovskaya in Belarus. We have to see. But how would you evaluate, just kind of generally, the state of the opposition right now?
I, of course, admire Yulia Navalny. She's an amazing person, and their love for each other, Alexei Navalny and his wife Yulia, was amazing. And both of them were not shy to express it in public, to express it in words and talk about it. Even Navalny's short letters that were sometimes posted on his social network from the penal colony. Many of them were about his love for his wife. Yulia, of course, is an extraordinary personality. However, for the same reasons that I mentioned to your previous question, frankly, I'm very skeptical that anyone at this point in time in Russia or outside Russia can make a difference in shaking this regime and creating a real challenge for this regime. Many people and many wonderful and smart and brave political oppositionists, opposition figures, have fled Russia and are trying to organize something from the outside. However, I would point out that we're now down, well, depends on your estimate, but we're now down to our fourth major wave of immigration from Russia in the past 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
The first immigration wave associated with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and then the atrocious fratricidal civil war, that immigration had very strong hopes that they would come back and make a difference. And they probably, of all the waves, had the most reason to actually expect that they would make a difference, because many of them, lots of them, had been those who had fought for their country, for their dream of a Russia as they wanted it to be in a civil war. As they had to flee after their defeat, they thought they would come back and fight again and recreate the Russia that had disappeared after the victory of the Bolsheviks, but they never made a difference. They were there were lots of soldiers, there were lots of politicians of different strains, many of them even anti-monarchy, but more of a pro-democracy European kind. But none of them made a difference. None of them ever come back to make a difference. And I think, unfortunately, there is no hope to expect that this wave of immigration would produce something that would make a difference in Russia. The regime, I'm sorry to say, is very solid, and it draws on Putin's popularity, his support. It draws on the fact that he has not had any opposition for a quarter century now. There is this sense of that he is a leader of no alternative, and especially at this point in time when the sense, the understanding among so many Russians that, as I mentioned, Russia is waging a defensive war, and Putin is an indispensable commander of his besieged fortress.
We've got maybe 5 more minutes of our conversation, and I want Michael to be able to ask a question too. But I have one more, and then Michael, you probably, I'm sure you have a question, but
I do have one, yes.
let me just ask, because it's so great to be able to talk with Masha. I just have one more. There are a million, but I'll ask this one. I'm kind of interested in the structure. Obviously, what happens at this point legally is the cabinet resigns, and then Putin forms another cabinet. And there are all these questions, does he have a plan? What if he dies? Will he have a big switch in his cabinet? Will more hardliners come in? There's all sorts of speculation. So, Masha, if you could delve into that a little bit. I know we don't have a direct line to the Kremlin, but what do you think?
There are rumors, all kinds of rumors circulating among political commentators these days. At the end of the day, we don't know. And Putin has demonstrated so many times that he's secretive. I'm sure he has an idea of who should and will be replaced. More hardliners is fairly possible. And Putin a short while ago said something like, we need a new elite in this country, and those who have fought this war should be our new elite. So I would not expect, all the positions in the Russian cabinet or the Russian legislature to be replaced by the war veterans, but we might have some. Or if not war veterans, then certainly hardliners, in a sense that this should be people with no liberal past, because right now we do have leftovers from the previous years and decades, who of course have now under very strong pressure to pledge allegiance to Putin and the war, and Ukraine belongs to Russia, and of course very harsh anti-Western stance. Everyone in the Russian elite today is under pressure to demonstrate this kind of political attitude. But there are hardliners who don't have a previous past, a previous career, which might show signs of liberalism or pro-Western sentiments. So we should expect more hardliners. And Putin certainly has his plans and has his ideas of who should be and must be replaced. We'll see, but I wouldn't expect a major reshuffling, like a full replacement, because that's destabilizing in any country, and Putin wouldn't want that for no other reason that new people in too many positions, they need to get time to get adjusted and learn about their offices. So we'll see soon, and we should be talking. I mean, for those who may not be fully aware about it, for all practical purposes, regional governors are also appointed. Well, technically they are elected, but in fact, nobody whom the Kremlin or Putin doesn't like can become a regional leader. So we may expect a replacement of some of those figures as well.
Interesting. Just a quick reminder before I turn to Michael. We're getting questions. That's great. I can see in the Q&A. So we're going to turn to those after this question from Michael. So please, anything that you have questions, put them in the Q&A function. And Michael?
Yes, thank you. So I have a question about the media, which is one of your specialties, and not just about the election coverage, but about broader trends because when we talk about media, we're talking also now about propaganda. And if you're right about the regime being so firm, there may be some indications that it may be brittle in a time of crisis, but right now it's firm. We have to be almost like Sovietologists and look at trends in reading. I mean, we see some big trends like, instead of the denazification narrative, it's now a lot more just anti-Western, anti-puppet master. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the trends in Russian media, including, for example, what we hear a lot about Belgorod, for example. We hear a lot about the occupied Ukrainian territories? How are they presented? What are some of the shifts that you're seeing?
Well, thank you so much for this question. Starting from your last point, the occupied territories is not, of course, the term that is used in the Russian official media. They are all the new territories. So it is de-emphasized. The fact that they used to be Ukrainian territories has been strongly de-emphasized. New. And of course, we hear reports that people there have overwhelmingly voted for Putin, just like elsewhere. There is not much coverage of those territories. It is only occasionally that bits and pieces are shown. With media in general, a more general remark, as we know from human experience, not necessarily Russian, you actually read and watch the information that you want to hear. And this is not only common for Russians. So it's not that people are unaware, it's more of a reluctance to know. And the war, even if it is generally supported, and actually there are several degrees of that support, it's more complicated, but it's still to so many disquieting and disturbing. And when something disquieting and disturbing is happening and there is nothing you can do about it, a natural human reaction is to turn your back to it and try to know less, not more. And I think if people give it a thought, many would realize that life in the occupied territories is not a happy life. And it is a life under occupation, even if this word is not used. But, you know, why focus on it? It is much safer to actually concentrate on your everyday life and go on with it. Pollsters who do focus groups this way these days say that they often hear from people, you know, too much worry is unhealthy for you. And this is talking about the war. Belgorod has gotten some attention recently because, well, maybe because it's been under even more concentrated attacks from Ukraine, and the Kremlin is now talking about evacuating children. I think the figure they cited was 9,000 children to be evacuated from Belgorod region. But of course, the focus would be at how the government is generous and how the government is concerned, not the actual state of affairs. It is certainly true that denazification and demilitarization, which were claimed to be the original goals of the war, have now been replaced, and this is not a new development. We are talking about over a year. And the longer the war drags on, the more the focus is this is not an offensive war. This is a defensive war. And this is a war against the West, which has concentrated on doing as much harm to Russia as possible. And this message is taken. And again, in focus groups, of course, for the obvious reason, I don't do them because I am abroad. But those who do, and there are pollsters in Russia who do focus groups, they say that actually this argument is well taken. And actually, Putin has made this argument for many years, way before the war, that the West is there to do harm to Russia. However, it's never been so easy for him to make this argument because apparently the West is supplying Ukraine with weapons, and the West is on the side of Ukraine, and the West is talking about how what are the ways to impose harsher sanctions for Russia, for the Russian economy to really suffer, and this conversation of sanctions and how to weaken the Russian military so that Russia would not be able to wage another war in the future. All of this makes, of course, Putin's argument easier. It is also important to know at this point that not everything that the Russian people hear these days can be referred to propaganda. They hear about economic success and the resilience of the Russian economy. And in fact, people's lives of actually many Russians have gotten better. And characteristically, this applies first and foremost to the poorer Russians. And to conclude my answer to your question, I will say that Levada Center pollster, the veteran independent pollster in Russia, has asked the question for year after year, the question being, whose interests does Putin represent? And for the first time in 20 plus years, people like myself, I mean, that's how the question is asked, common people like myself, has come up as number second, whereas during previous years, it was number 6 or number 7. This is quite, I think, important. It is important to remember that they see Putin now and the Kremlin as the state, if you like, many people see as their defender. The state cares for us.
That's fascinating. Oh, sorry, Michael.
I
Okay.
just said thank you for that response. Yes.
All right. I want to get to the questions because there's some good ones in there. I'll take 2 because they're kind of similar. One is from Jan Kalicki about Yulia Navalnaya. So we'll start with that. Do you expect Yulia Navalnaya to succeed as her husband's political successor? We kind of got into this, but quote, how can we best help her and her team? And are there any likely successors inside Russia? And I'm presuming that is opposition. And then the other one has to do with Putin's motivation. This is from Martin Singer. Can you comment on Putin's motivation for uttering Navalny's name, which he did probably for the first time right after the election? He never referred to Navalny. It was always that incarcerated person or whatever.
On Yulia Navalnaya, I think I can only repeat that personally, I have my deepest admiration and, of course, sympathy, and my heart goes out for her, mourning her husband these days. On how the West can help her, well, my answer would be ask her. She's there, and I think she had some things to say about the current Russian diaspora, that it should be treated better, and especially those in opposition should not be treated like representatives of the Kremlin. It is important to differentiate between supporters and opponents. I can only repeat that I'm afraid that the opposition or oppositionists abroad, because we're not talking about a political party, an opposition political party that emigrated. We're talking about disparate figures, small groups. We're talking about events such as conferences and various forms of getting together and discuss the affairs in Russia, but we're not talking about an organized opposition, and certainly not an opposition that has a following and organized supporters inside Russia. Certainly not oppositionists are left in Russia who are not jailed. That's very important to remember. Indeed, Putin always avoided mentioning, referring to Navalny by name. He very consciously and conspicuously avoided pronouncing this name Navalny. And when Navalny was recovering from his almost deadly poisoning in Germany, Putin opted for referring to him as European patient or German patient and some such. In fact, the first time Putin ever referred to Navalny by name was very recently, after his victory. Press conference, he was asked about Navalny, and he said something that he had been ready to for a swap, that he was considering actually exchanging him for somebody else who is kept in jail outside of Russia, which was surprising. But you know, this sounded so conspicuous that he can only refer to him by name when he's already dead, that this actually only deepened the suspicion of those who thought that Navalny was actually intentionally killed at this very moment. There's no question that his death is caused by the horrific condition in the penal colony. So he was killed by the Kremlin in any way, but whether he was killed, it was a premeditated murder just days before we're not even sure whether this conversation, these talks about swap were real or realistic. The fact that Putin only referred to him by names deepens the suspicion that actually, now that he is no longer of any danger, of any risk, now that the hated enemy, and I would say probably Putin hated Navalny more than he was afraid of him as a political rival. So now that there's no longer, that his hated enemy is no longer around, it is safe to refer to him by name.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have a question from David Slade. Is there no hope that if the war goes poorly and more body bags come home, that there may be a broad-based negative domestic reaction similar to what happened after Afghanistan?
Well, about Afghanistan, actually, the war went on and on and on during the Soviet period, and the Soviet people barely knew it was going on. And certainly they wouldn't learn anything about it from the Soviet newspapers. We are not in that situation right now. However, I mean, how many more body bags? The toll of casualties is unbelievably high at this point. We don't know the exact number, but it is in high tens of thousands for sure. Maybe over, maybe even over 100,000. So is the war going on poorly? This is not what people believe. And actually, I think recently it is rather that it is going more poorly for Ukraine. There were moments when the war went poorly for Russia, but mostly it was the fall of 2022 when the Russian military were withdrawing from some of the major cities that they had occupied. But I wouldn't say the war is going on poorly now. Not for Russia. This is not what Putin believes, and this is not what the Russian people believe. And actually, in this, of course, public opinion polls are a poor indication, but people assume that the war would go on for a year or two at least. In any case, they are not yearning for the war to be over. It should be remembered that the percentage of Russians not directly involved in the war in Russia is much, much higher than the number of those uninvolved in the war in Ukraine. So the percentage of families whose members are fighting or were killed is so much higher in Ukraine. So if we're talking about fatigue and we're talking about the difference that the fatigue can make, talking about Ukraine as well. I know that the Ukrainians have demonstrated amazing resilience, but the toll also has been extremely high in Ukraine as well.
Mm. And you know that theme from Putin about sacrificing for the motherland has really gotten strong, you know, that, well, he died, but he died for the motherland. That type of, I don't know, glorification of death in war it looks like it's pretty strong at this point. So that might be another factor. But, you know, we have a question from Mikhail Buzin, and it's kind of long, but I'll make it a little shorter here. When is the West finally going to come up with a streamlined scheme for Russian citizens to avoid repression and be able to draw their assets out of Russia? And this person is saying, Mikhail, is saying, for instance, Navalny's lawyer was initially refused a humanitarian visa by Germany, and now he's in prison. Russians have trouble opening bank accounts abroad, thus financing the war through the Russian financial tax systems. What's going on? What's wrong with Western politics? I might tag onto that. You know, there is this feeling in some Western countries that Russians are toxic. You know, you are not wanted here. I can tell you right here in Tbilisi, the amount of graffiti on every single building is mind-boggling. I have literally never seen that much graffiti, and much of it is very anti-Russian and obscene. A lot of it's really just very obscene, get out of here type of stuff. So I guess the question is, you know, he's saying the West, but different countries do different things. But should the West be more welcoming of Russians and allow them to come without visa restrictions and other restrictions?
Well, I think this is a very appropriate question. And as I briefly mentioned before, I think this was what Yulia Navalny said too in one of her addresses since the death of her husband. She too called the West to be more welcoming toward those Russians who are actually victims of Putin's regime, if not people who have been jailed and people who felt that they had to abandon their motherland and had to become itinerant and homeless. You know, I would just say, I mean, this is not a question to ask of me, and I'm not a Western decision maker, and I am myself an exile. But I would just say that to me, it feels and looks just so wrong to judge people based on their citizenship. Or where they come from, not on what they actually are. I too know of instances of people being denied the residence permit, even people with a story of persecutions and prosecution in Russia. Of people who were denied visas, who could not enter countries, even countries where their families are today. So I know these stories, of course, as myself in exile of now 2 years. But I guess this question should be asked, and maybe in this, Yulia Navalny may have a say. If, unfortunately, I have to admit that I don't expect her to make a difference for Russia or Russian politics or the sort of political regime that Russia has evolved as, maybe she will have a say, and maybe Western governments will listen to her as far as the fate of Russian refugees and exiles are concerned.
Yeah, she did say one thing that I thought was quite interesting. Right after the vote, the election, she was saying Western governments should not recognize this election, which is pretty I don't know, extreme maybe, but what she's saying is just don't consider Putin the president. Do you think that that's, obviously it's probably not going to happen, but that is what she said. What do you think about that, Mashi?
Well, frankly, I think this is emotional, and I don't think, well, certainly this will not happen. But you know, looking at the world as it is today, and in general, I mean, how do you turn the leader of the second most powerful nuclear nation into a rogue? I mean, you should have an opportunity to negotiate with him. And I hope at some point there will be negotiations and this war would end, even if in a temporary ceasefire or some such. In any case, I don't think it's wise. Russia is not North Korea. Russia cannot be just simply ignored. Not that North Korea is fully ignored. However, world leaders do not have to wake up and go to bed thinking about what to do with the North Korean leadership. The factor of nuclear arms, if not, you know, some other factors, makes, I think, any such proposition not very wise.
Although you have the ICC indicting him as a war criminal.
Well, I'm not sure how this might evolve. There is a history, of course, of prosecuting national leaders for war crimes. And well, for instance, the leader of former Yugoslavia, Milosevic was one, and not the only one. But I doubt that that Vladimir Putin will one day find himself in prison in The Hague or wherever that prison is. For a national leader to be really prosecuted, not in absentia, it takes to have him, to seize him, which is only possible in one of the two situations. Either his own nation has given him up, which has happened to some of the war criminals in former Yugoslavia, or Russia is defeated and occupied by an outside force. Again, a proposition that is just so unrealistic that we can easily say this will never happen.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to take you to a place that some of people here in Tbilisi that I've been talking with would kind of go in that direction and actually say, okay, Putin is elected. And this is similar to a question from Colin Frank. He was asking, would the opposition turn to violence? And actually, there are some people who have carried out actions in Ukraine or along the border, Belgorod. But I'm going to switch it around and say Putin is empowered by and emboldened by this election. And the theory goes that he will use it as a mandate to crack down even more strongly on the opposition. Already, it's incredibly strong. But do you think, as a result of this election, Maria, that he will just really crank it up even more and in almost a Stalin type manner at home?
Well, historical analogies can be taken only that far. And I would remind the person who asked the question that Russian borders are open, quite unlike Stalin's times. Russia is not behind an Iron Curtain. Actually, civil servants of a certain position, beginning from a certain position, are not allowed to leave the country. Millions and millions of government officials are not, administrators of various levels, but opposition figures can. And the tactic of the Kremlin so far has been rather to push them out than jail as many as they can. Much as the regime has turned repressive, and very harshly so, and more repressive with time. And sentences get longer and longer, but the actual number of people jailed, opposition figures, for really, minor, on the very minor pretexts, that number comparatively is not very high. Certainly not comparable to Stalin's times. So the regime is sending a signal that anybody who is disloyal and who is actually openly disloyal in public, with leaving a graffiti on the wall or, I don't know, writing something, something anti-Putin on their social network, that they are not wanted, and that they have a choice. Leave now. You do not belong in this country. We don't want you here. But if you stay inside, then you will be subject to the kind of treatment that the government is not concealing will be really, really harsh. That's the tactic right now. And will it get harsher? It might. And I think it can be expected that the government will get even more merciless towards those who dare, who actually take the risk of acting in a disloyal fashion.
Yeah. Remember that phrase, traitors and scum, that he used, a year ago or whatever?
Indeed. And, from just my own recollection, when I was leaving the country, which was early March 2022, we all very much expected that borders would be closed and those inside would be locked up. But it's been 2 years since then, And this hasn't happened, which to me is a signal that this kind of tactic, this kind of signal has not changed. So if you are if you cannot reconcile, if you are not ready, if you are a Russian in Russia and you are not ready and willing to restrict your anti-government conversation to your apartment with your friends, then you probably should consider leaving. We are not behind an iron curtain for a variety of reasons, the internet being one, and open borders is a very important one, another, but the repressive nature of the government, the intolerance, the zero tolerance toward any manifestation of disloyalty makes it look like a besieged fortress.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'm going to end on a question by Pamela Spratlin. And we have, just about 5 minutes left. So I guess we'll have to keep it a little brief. But Pamela's question is, if there is virtually no hope in the short term for a political change, what should Russians who want change do and think about for the longer term, post 2030?
Well, there is actually no constraint on what one should think. Fortunately, not even Stalin's government could that. People think, and I would say currently abroad are many very bright minds, many people who have good ideas and insights about Russia, about Russian history and culture and how that can evolve. And they are free to express themselves and write and get together in conferences and otherwise. As to what they should do, I wish I had an answer for that. Maybe this is a matter of age. My younger colleagues who are currently in exile have their own expectations, and of course they can hope that Putin's power is not forever, and then when Putin is no more for whatever reason, something will change in Russia. However, I frankly do not hope to live to see that. It gets in the way of this kind of thinking, in my case, that I'm exactly Putin's age, same years, even same month. So for my part, I certainly cannot hope for, things will get better and I will go back to my country when Putin dies. But it's not immortal. I don't think anyone, even in Russia, doubts that. But what might come afterwards is at this point anybody's guess. However, I wouldn't hope for a revolutionary change. Russia, the day after Putin disappears into thin air, dies or whatever, Russia will become a totally different country. It doesn't happen this way. Russia has been waging a horrific war. Russian population, those who have the experience of fighting in the war and others have been brutalized. They will come back to Russia. We know from the experience of many countries how traumatizing this experience is for the nation. So I really cannot believe that things would change overnight. But we may hope and we may think about what it might be like when Russia will have a different government and what kind of a political regime might realistically appear after that.
Mm-hmm. Well, boy, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much, Maria Lipman, Masha, my colleague and friend. Really
Thank you very much.
Deep comments, and thank you. Appreciate it very much. And I appreciate the questions. We always get good questions, good audience here. So it really made us think. And again, thank you, Georgetown University and the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its generous support of our programming. And I hope you can come back next month for another Russia brief. As I said, I think we will do something on Georgia. So I'll be back in Washington. I won't have this beautiful view. Well, you're getting reflection here, but beautiful view of the river And Tbilisi, oh, there you get a little bit. Tbilisi at night. So thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you soon.